Good afternoon. I'm here today to talk about the impact of trauma, being trauma-informed, and to offer survivors a way to rise above their traumatic past. I'm going to make this a little experiential and ask you to check in with yourself when you hear that word trauma and identify your own personal definition for it. For me, before I was trained, I recognized that I knew very little about trauma. For me, it was a term reserved for veterans returning from war zones, or people that may have experienced what we may call a big T traumatic event. Those life-changing moments in time that for these individuals continue to torment or haunt them, until eventually they may stumble on support or freedom through treatment. That's if the community was willing to meet them there. And I'd like to take a beat and really honor those that I've worked with directly for teaching me what I've learned, and I continue to be in awe of their courage to heal. Later, when I began my clinical work, I began in spaces that you'd fully expect to find the impact of trauma. The foster care system, and while working with women recovering from addictions. And even there was very little awareness of how trauma impacted the individuals they were servicing. There was this sort of dance between the provider and the survivor. The provider is asking them to function in the here and now. But the survivor has this strong tether pulling them to the past. So those that are servicing them only see the behaviors and reactions and are puzzled about what to do with them. Later, I ended up in working with addictions, people who also experience severe mental health conditions. And I found there that trauma was this sort of entity lurking around every corner. Every narrative that was shared with me in sessions contained unimaginable pain. And what I realized was that it was fuel. Fuel for the addictions, but interestingly, it was fuel for the symptoms that were categorized as mental disorders. When I began training in EMDR, it's an evidence-based trauma treatment, I recognized that trauma was built over time. Everything from misattunements in childhood, exposure to microaggressions, discrimination, over time became kindling for future traumatization. And I also recognized that I knew little about the insidiousness of trauma, the subtlety of it. That we may, from the outside, consider something traumatic, but the individual may not see it that way. There is also this lack of awareness in spaces, right, that it's built in the individual over time. There's a quote for me that really emphasizes this idea. Being traumatized means continuing to organize your life as if the trauma were still going on, unchanged and immutable, as every new encounter or event is contaminated by the past. That's by Bessel van der Kolk, and he's a trauma expert. And that really drove that home for me. It made me understand that it's something that's accrued and something that impacts the here and now and makes the here and now at certain points traumatizing as well. And trauma also leaves very little room for the individual as a result of that experience being built over time. Very little room for the individual to process everyday experiences. It makes their tolerance for everyday challenges pretty narrow. So something that you and I would consider an average everyday nuisance may trigger a fight, flight, or freeze response. Those responses reserved for the nervous system to deploy when it detects danger. It also leaves behind messaging. Messaging about the self, about who they are, about how they connect to other people, and if they're safe. I've heard messaging like, I'm worthless. I don't know how to protect myself. I'm unlovable. I have to be perfect. So how does this messaging land? How does it show up when individuals present themselves to the world, to other people? Mary Harvey said in 1990, and she's another one of those trauma experts, trauma survivors have symptoms instead of memories. So what are some of those symptoms? Depression, anxiety, dysregulation, anger outbursts, chronic pain, which was a surprising one, migraines, those are just some of them, insomnia. And if some of these experiences, if some of these symptoms dominate for an individual, what I found interesting is that instead of identifying as a trauma survivor, they instead identified with their symptoms. So instead of saying, I'm a trauma survivor, it was, well, maybe I'm a depressed person. Maybe I'm an angry person. Maybe I'm an anxious person. Instead of what they truly are. So what does it mean to be trauma informed? Well, it begins with a conversation that is meant to bring out a curiosity in both you and the survivor. A curiosity about how they function in the here and now, and to wonder about the why. It is not about digging in the painful details to get the story. It's about helping them accept that they may need to make some space for themselves and to challenge that messaging that was left behind. So I want to take a break, a pause, to ask you to check in with yourself once again. What's being generated for you inside? How is your body responding when I'm talking about these experiences? And to consider if any of what I've said has shifted your definition of trauma, how trauma shows up. So how do we rise above our traumatic past? How do we rise above trauma? Well, what I found through all of my training and everything I learned in school and working with survivors is that the messaging is pretty much the same. We're asking people to really think about those core beliefs about themselves and to challenge them. To offer evidence that it may be different. And to get them to be here with us in the now, but also honor their story at the same time. And how do we do that? How does that look in practice? Well, it takes something called self-compassion. Now again, checking in with yourself, what does that mean? What does that mean to me when I think of those words, self-compassion? Kristen Neff, who was a lead researcher on this subject, she broke it down in 3 components. The first, self-kindness. The second, a sense of common humanity. And the third, mindfulness. I'm going to go through each one. Self-kindness is meant to deal with self-judgment. It was striking to me that every individual that came to work with me had this extremely self-critical internal monologue. Everything they did in their daily lives was met with ridicule. How could I not get that right? Something's got to be wrong with me that I can't make this work. It's a me issue. Instead of offering a gentler, kinder voice. And it was hard for them at times to even take in my voice when I tried to offer some compassion and some gentleness. Self-kindness means a daily practice to meet that old messaging with grace, with a softer, kinder attitude toward yourself, towards the situation you're in. The second, a sense of common humanity, deals with that isolation that comes with being a trauma survivor. No one experienced those events, plural, that event the same way you did, even if they were there. There's too much context. It's steeped in complicated relationships. So no one truly gets it the same way. So it's easy to isolate. Because no one can meet you there. No one's as attuned. But when we go to other spaces where there are other trauma survivors, or we share our story with a caring witness, it brings us out of that space. We may not fully understand, but we're there to listen. And we can access points in our own experience, maybe the other can access points in their own experience, that connects with the ideas that you're sharing. It's not going to look the same. But every human understands pain, emotional pain. Every human understands what it's like to feel that they may mess up at times, that they're not perfect. Everyone has weaknesses. And we can connect with people on that level. Mindfulness, the last one, it's thrown around a lot in a lot of modalities, but what does it truly mean in practice? It means allowing states, positive, neutral, negative, to come through. Today, here in this talk, I'm letting that come through, right? But I'm not letting it attach itself to my identity. I'm not letting it inform me about who I am. It's just a state of being. In 2 minutes, it's going to be over. Right? But you have to make space for those feelings. That's what it means to be human. You can't let those feelings take you out of here, out of now. So in summary, self-compassion. Right? What are we asking a person to do? We're asking them to meet us here, but we're also asking them to make a little space for themselves. And in that space, find a gentler approach to how you treat yourself. Carl Rogers, the founder of Person-Centered Therapy, said, "The curious paradox is that when I accept myself as I am, then I can change." Giving yourself that space to provide that compassion allows one a chance to recognize their worthiness, that they can have meaningful relationships, that not every experience will send them back to the past. And no matter who you are, whether you're a trauma survivor or not, the relationship to yourself is the most important one you'll ever have. Thank you.